Hi, how's everyone doing? All right. What do we call that? Like mild enthusiasm, I think. I think we're going to get to better. Yes? In like 5 seconds. Incredible. Thank you for that. My name's Aidan Flax-Clark. I'm the director of Live from NYPL, and I'm so thrilled you all are here. I'm thrilled everyone is joining us online. And I get to introduce Beverly Gage tonight, who, as I'm sure you know, is a historian and a professor at Yale, and the author of, among other things, the Pulitzer Prize winning G-Man, J. Edgar Hoover, and the Making of the American Century. But of course, we're here to learn from her about her new book, This Land is Your Land, A Road Trip Through U.S. History. In it, she travels the country to see museums, historic sites, roadside attractions, reenactments, and souvenir shops where Americans learn, and much more importantly, fight about our history. And appropriately, I suppose, she'll be speaking of fighting, fellow historian Joanne Freeman, whose widely beloved book, The Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road to the Civil War, she in fact worked on here at the library some years ago as a fellow at the library's Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. Both of their full bios are, of course, in your programs, or if you're watching online, they are on the YouTube page. This year is the perfect year for Beverly to be publishing... I dare you to come up here and say that in front of people, of our national birth in July of 1776. And here at the library, we are marking 250 years of the United States in a lot of ways. Book talks like tonight's, or in a few weeks with Annette Gordon-Reed discussing Thomas Jefferson's writing on race. But all across the library, there are a ton of incredible things happening. In this building alone, we are soon to open a massive multi-part exhibition all over the building, which is called Declaring America, 1776 and Beyond. It will unpack the complex, diverse, and powerful stories of the American Revolution from 1776 to today. One part will focus on New York's role in the first months of the American Revolution. Another will trace the role of protest throughout our country's history. And a third, which is actually already open, I mean, it's not technically open, but it's there, is a beautiful showcase of contemporary art that grapples with enduring questions tied to our democratic ideals. So next time you're here, head up to the third floor and check it out. It is beautiful, but all three of them will be open by June. And past that, there are all kinds of free programs, events, educational offerings, book lists, and a whole lot more all across the system. So if any of that sounds interesting, and I assume we're all nerds here, so I assume that it does, you can go to nypl.org/US250. I mean, I'm not a nerd, but you know. For tonight's talk, This Land is Your Land is available for sale outside. Hopefully some of you purchased your copies on the way in, but if not, don't worry, you can purchase it on the way out. And I believe Beverly will be signing copies of the book up here on stage afterwards. And you can, of course, check it out with your library card. I won't even bother to ask if you have it. I know you do. You'd be a monster to show up here without it. Lastly, when you walked in, you got note cards. Those are for asking questions. Please write them down anytime during the talk. Some of my colleagues will come by to collect them, and we will pass them up at the end of the discussion. And if you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat, and we'll be glad to receive it there. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and more importantly, by all of you here. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you for being here, and let's please give it up for Joanne Freeman and Beverly Gage.
Thank you all for coming. What a great audience. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to be here with my colleague at Yale, Beverly Gage. And I get to ask you all kinds of questions about your book. But I want to start with a basic question, because it's an unusual book. It's a history book. It's a travelogue of sorts. So what inspired you to write this kind of book?
Well, thank you for being here, Joanne, and thank you all for being here as well. I started thinking about this book really in early 2023 when I started looking ahead to 2026 and thinking, I think this is going to be an important moment to think about. And how am I, partly as a 20th century historian, how am I going to engage that moment? I'm probably not going to write a book about the American Revolution. And so I wanted to produce something that could capture the full sweep of American history. I knew I did not want to write a textbook, and this is a form of travel that I've always loved doing. So some of what's in here was inspired by trips that I've taken, mainly with my son, but with other people as well. And so, it just sort of came into my mind, both as a lark and as a way to engage this moment. I would say, in the most serious vein, I was really troubled at the time and even more since about certain aspects of our historical discourse at the moment, in which either people are expected to be uncritical patriots and not say anything that disparages the Americans of the past. These are actually signs that now hang in a lot of National Park Service sites. If you see anything that disparages the people of the past, report that to your federal government so we can fix it. Many people, I think, have not been participating in that, but the signs are, in fact, there now. And then on the other hand, a story that was like, there's nothing to celebrate, there's nothing to do but to reject a moment like this. The only things that matter about the United States are its darkest moments and its worst injustices. And so I wanted to kind of lean into the tension between those two and do it from behind the steering wheel.
Actually, let's kind of get at that in a specific way, because one of the things that comes out of the book is the, how do I want to put it, challenges of doing interpretation in the South, given the question of slavery, given questions about race. So maybe talk a little bit about what evidence you saw of that. You have really interesting passages about, you talk about a guide at Fort Sumter who, quote, tried to avoid taking sides. Talk a little bit about how that played out.
So the book is organized in 13 chapters, and every chapter is both a place and a moment in time. So it starts in Philadelphia with the American Revolution. It ends in California in the late 20th century with Disneyland and Ronald Reagan, and then it moves around a lot in between. So many of the chapters in between there are Southern chapters. There's one on Virginia, in which I go to many of the presidential sites in Virginia and think about the tensions between liberty and slavery that are really baked into the American founding. There's a chapter on Tennessee. We can debate, is Tennessee the South or not? I don't know. Some people would say yes, others would say no. But for my purposes, I think that it was. That's really focused on Andrew Jackson, indigenous displacement. There's an Atlanta chapter on the New South. There's a Texas chapter on the 1830s and 40s and the Texas Rebellion. And there's a civil rights chapter that's really Alabama and Mississippi. So I spent a lot of time in the South, and I guess there were two things that I noticed. One is that I actually think that Southern historical sites are doing the best job of any place in the country of, first of all, really grappling with slavery, but in some ways really grappling with race as a category of division and contest throughout American history. And that's largely because they've been forced to do that by both their past and then the politics of the present. And it's also, of course, an area where that history is still being contested in a whole variety of ways. I went to Stone Mountain in Atlanta, which is a big Confederate bas-relief carved into this very large kind of granite mountain. There, and I went for Confederate Memorial Day, and so down at the base of the mountain,
brave person.
Was I just walked right in and went to the kind of pro-Confederate rally that was happening at the base of the mountain, and then there was a counter rally happening further up the hill, and then there were a lot of police in between, and so that was a particularly dramatic example of a lot of the tensions that are being played out, day to day, that come from history but are very much alive.
Alive in the form of people, and I'm going to come back to this, alive in the form of spaces. That's a great thing about your book, is that you show the ways in which sometimes being in a space gives you such a sense of its history. And along the lines of what we're talking about here, you talk about how in Atlanta, there was an area where there was an Emmett Till Interpretive Center on one corner, and a Tallahatchie County courthouse across the street. There was a statue of a Confederate soldier at one place and a marker honoring Emmett Till at the other. So did you see many of those kinds of spaces where the conflicts in the history and the unsettled or unreconciled or unwrestled with aspects of this history were that apparent?
Yeah, so that was in the Mississippi Delta, not in Atlanta, but it was a very stark illustration of something that you see really all over the place. One of the other startling things, I actually didn't write about this, I think, but that I noticed was in going to Montgomery, Alabama, which is really flourishing in terms of its historical engagement and tourism and new museums opening, but I had never physically been there, and one of the things that I saw and realized that I'm sure I read in a book many times but did not internalize is that the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King was pastor, is basically right in the shadow of the Alabama state capitol there, which was at one point the capital of the Confederacy. And so there they are, they're about a block apart, you can see one from the other, and they have just been staring each other down for decades now. And I didn't realize that till I was actually physically in the place, even if I had read about it in a book. Not that there's anything wrong with books. Books are also very important.
Books are excellent. We like books. Related to this topic, you say at one point that while you were in the South, your ideas about whiteness changed. And the statement you make is, I felt my whiteness differently on the civil rights trail, not just as a fact of life, but as a set of assumptions about who I was, what I cared about, and what I knew. Unpack that a little bit.
Well, I think there's a piece of that that was about just being a historian on the road, but I would show up to civil rights sites in particular, and they would, sit me down along with the other people who were there and say, all right, we know you don't like to talk about it. You might not even believe that it happened, but there was slavery in this country. And so I just felt like, okay, come on, give me a little more credit than that. But it was interesting that I think a lot of those assumptions really were about race. And there are, in funny ways, still very different cultures of historic visitation in a lot of southern cities. My favorite probably was in Jackson, Mississippi, which I also didn't write about a whole lot, but they opened really a fantastic new state-run civil rights museum about 10 or 15 years ago, and it is in the same building as the Mississippi State History Museum. And so it's a sort of awkward thing, and people make a lot of awkward jokes like, well, it's not the white museum and the black museum, but there was a little bit of a vibe to that, and actually that was a little bit of the separation of the crowds going in. So you still see little flickers of it, and the expectation is you're going to that museum and not the other, though of course I'm hardly the only person doing that.
Before we leave this topic, because you actually started off by glancing at it, one of the, I was going to say unsung heroes, but they're sung heroes in your book are national park rangers, are interpreters. They're out there wrestling with this history that you're finding ways to connect with and write about. They're out there in the midst of people trying to put it together in ways that are doing justice to the complexity of it. It feels like that pretty much uniformly was your experience of rangers. I just think these interpreters need credit for that kind of work. They deserve credit for that kind of work.
I hope this is very much a book that is about love and respect for the people who are doing this kind of work. It is difficult work. It's particularly challenging work in this moment. And one of the things that I thought was really valuable about actually going out into various parts of the country, seeing the historic sites, walking around, and I really did this as an ordinary tourist, so I was not, going to meet with the executive director of the organization, but I was just kind of going through, taking the tours, seeing as anyone else might in most cases. And that's the thing. It's really different from our sort of algorithm filtered world when we're sitting on screens. These are places that anyone can walk into. These are folks who are sort of on the front lines of historical interpretation and are constantly thinking about, how do I take this history and make it speak to and with people where they are? Where are they starting from? What knowledge are they coming in with? What set of assumptions are they coming in with? And how can we make history live for them? And it's not just national park rangers who are under particular kinds of pressure at the moment. It's true at all sorts of privately run sites too, right? That's the thing. Their doors are open and anyone can walk in and start asking questions.
And different combinations of people can walk in, and then they have to wrestle with that as well. There were the spaces in your book, the actual physical spaces in your book, were really fascinating. And there are two of them that stood out to me that I want to ask about. One of them is Susan B. Anthony's attic. The way you talk about it really stood out. So maybe give a sense of why that stood out to you.
This is from chapter 5 of the book, which is a trip through the Erie Canal corridor, so Albany to Buffalo. I should say there is no New York City in the book, so there are some very obvious historic places that are not in the book. New York, there's no Boston, there's no Washington, D.C. There are some obvious places, but in some cases, I really wanted to go to places that people might not think about going, and I think that the Erie Canal corridor is one of those. What's really fascinating about it is that from the moment that the Erie Canal was built in the 1820s, but especially into the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, it became not only a hotbed of religious revivalism, but also of kind of political utopianism. And so a lot of the abolitionist movement is happening there. A lot of the women's rights movement, hence Susan B. Anthony really gets its start in these little towns in upstate New York where these incredible figures are really just neighbors with each other. Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, John Brown, Harriet Tubman. They are all living together in these little cities of upstate New York during the years before the Civil War. So Susan B. Anthony's home is in Rochester, and it's a great tour if you've never been there. But that attic really struck me. It's the third floor of the house, and it has some wood paneling. It's kind of a nice attic, but small. And that attic was built because Susan B. Anthony and the other women she was working with could not rent meeting halls in Rochester. No one would rent to them. They were rabble-rousers. They were not respectable women. And so she built this attic as a place where they knew that they could come and they could gather together. And it's just this tiny little third floor. It's, I'm almost 6 feet tall, and so I could barely stand up there. And I just thought about the energy and the friendships and the relationships and the transformative ideas that took root in this one little place. And so it's a remarkable place to be for that reason.
And the way that it captures the exclusion of those ideas. And so they were cramped in this attic trying to get these ideas out. It's really striking the way that you write about it. Now, there's another space, and I just can't resist asking you about. You slept in a nuclear missile silo. So I have to ask you about that.
So that was an intense space. This is from a chapter that is about World War II and the Cold War and the ways that they transformed the American landscape. And I did this by going to the Southwest, primarily Nevada and New Mexico. And outside of Roswell, New Mexico, there is an Atlas missile silo, so one of the first generation of missile silos that has now been converted into an Airbnb. So you all may also go to outside of Roswell, New Mexico, and spend the night in a missile silo. So there are a couple of things that are really intense about this. One, it's really in the middle of nowhere. That's where you put missile silos. And so I was doing this traveling alone, and so there was a kind of deep breath. Okay, I'm just going to descend underground here in this space by myself and see what happens. It is run by a man who grew up around there and in his early years did what a lot of people in the Roswell area did, which was that teenagers, once they pulled the missiles out but left the silos, teenagers used to go down into the silos and have parties and escape from their parents. And so the silos actually covered with graffiti from basically 90s parties. So that was sort of interesting. And then there was something just very intense about being there. It's actually quite a nice little apartment down there. But being underground and hearing the silence underground and thinking about the people who lived there when there was, in fact, a missile there, and they were in charge of knowing very little, but knowing a whole lot about that missile, and supposed to be there to, create human destruction when the order came in. And so it was a real connection with both the marvels of that moment. It's kind of an extraordinary thing to look at, but also, the kind of deep fears and transformations that came along with the Cold War.
How did that idea come to you? I mean, how are you thinking, I'm going to write this kind of a book? I'm going to sleep in a nuclear missile silo. Where did the idea come from?
Well, that one came a little randomly. So I knew I wanted to go to the Southwest to tell this story because so much of the Southwest was both built by this kind of military infusion and military investment, and also because it's a place that has begun to transform some of that into historic sites that you can visit. As you get further and further along into the 20th century, of course, the history is more recent, and so there are fewer places to go, but the Southwest is really rich in that. So I knew I wanted to go to Los Alamos, and I knew I wanted to go to the Titan Missile Museum in Tucson, Arizona. I knew I wanted to go to Las Vegas and such, so I was just planning my itinerary, and I came across an article that said, you also want to go here. I actually was going to go to Roswell anyway, because I find Roswell really interesting in its own right. As you probably know, Roswell is allegedly the site of an alien crash landing in 1947, and a lot of the town's culture is built around the myth of that moment.
And this builds right off of sleeping in a nuclear missile silo, where do you feel like you saw the present most in the past?
Well, it was interesting to see the relationship between the present and past, because that's really what these trips are about. I'm going to historic sites, but of course, when you go to historic sites, you're also going to the living, breathing place as it exists now. And one of the things that I hadn't quite thought through was that some places that I was visiting in their history, say the Houston, Texas area, I was going to learn about the 1830s and 1840s, the Texas Rebellion, and ultimately Texas statehood, the war with Mexico. And at that time, this is a sort of a nothing place that's just on the rise. And now, of course, it's this enormous metropolis. And so that was one example of trying to connect the past and the present. But of course, other places that I went had their peak in the moment that I was visiting and now have gone into some level of decline. So Dearborn, Michigan was one of those. The Detroit area, I wrote a chapter about Henry Ford and the rise of mass industry in the United States and the rise of the American labor movement in the 1920s and 30s. But what you're going to visit there now, if you go to the River Rouge plant, which was Henry Ford's great industrial masterpiece, was once the largest industrial facility in the world. What you're going to now is almost a historic ruin. Parts of it are still in operation. They're still building the Ford F-150 in part of that facility, and you can go in and see this production happening. But other aspects of it are this sort of ghostly ruin and testament to a really lost industrial past and an experience of decline.
To historical change. Okay, the next question maybe says more about how I think as a historian than you. So I don't know. You'll have to tell me if you think this way. But particularly in the times in which we're living right now, I feel like I have two different brains that are functioning at any given moment. And one of them is historian brain. And historian brain is fascinated by what's going on. Historian brain has detachment. Historian brain can say, oh, well, we've seen this phenomenon before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. American brain just shrieks a lot. So, and I feel like I'm constantly juggling between historian brain evaluating things and American brain sort of slapping me around and saying, you can't just step back and evaluate. So this might be my own crazy way of thinking about things, but when you were going through this experience, did you ever feel pulled one way or another like that? Were there moments when historian Beverly Gage was front and center, and then American Beverly Gage sort of came out from behind and said, wait a minute?
I like that way of putting it. I've been having a chance this past academic year to learn more and more about Joanne's brain because we taught a class together, and so this does sound like a good description of your brain.
I hope that's good.
And mine to some degree. I guess I would say I mostly found the experience of writing this book, doing this traveling, and then sitting down with the material and trying to stitch it all together. I mostly found it to be comforting in the sense that, first of all, as you begin to go through American history, you realize, oh, there have been lots and lots of dark moments in the past. And that, in fact, the book opens with Benjamin Franklin, after the Constitutional Convention, coming out and saying, is the sun rising or falling over this republic that has been created, or at least allegedly? You can tell me if that's not really a thing that happened, but it's a good, yeah, okay. So it is both fact and useful myth. And so that anxiety in and of itself has a deep history in this country from the moment it was created. Are we falling apart? Is the country flying apart? Are we in a moment of decline? Are we in a moment of collapse? So seeing that set of questions recur again and again, seeing the ways that, in fact, many of the difficult, dark, and divided moments one has made it through. And then a lot of what this book is about historical characters, some of whom I would have expected to engage, others of whom were a surprise to me, who really wrestled with exactly these questions at different moments in American history and tried to take what they could find in the American past to make it useful in the present. So thinking again about the Erie Canal Corridor, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, so many of the characters who are in that chapter were engaged with both committing to this country, being engaged with it, and being horrified by it, its institutions, its cruelties, and setting out to think about how they could make some sort of intervention and some sort of change with reference to both the best and worst parts of the American past.
Now, you just mentioned that some people, their presence surprised you. So what's an example of that?
Well, I did not think I was going to write so much about Davy Crockett.
Surprise!
But he became a recurring character in the book. I first met Davy Crockett in Tennessee when I was writing the chapter about Andrew Jackson, and David Crockett, as the historical character, was a protege of Andrew Jackson's, went to Congress really as a Jacksonite, but has this very interesting moment, which this is not my period of history. I don't spend time thinking about Crockett a whole lot, but had this really interesting moment in which he became the only congressman from Tennessee who voted against Indian removal, which was, of course, one of Andrew Jackson's signature policies. And it's one of the things that ruined his political career in Tennessee. It's not the first thing we think of, but he was an example of a sort of famous and maybe time-worn and tired character who I really found to be much more interesting than I might have thought. But because his career fell apart in Tennessee, he then left for Texas, which was my next chapter. And so I sort of followed Davy Crockett to Texas, where things did not go very well for him, because he went to the Alamo and then died, was killed at the Alamo. So you would think that would be the end of my engagement with Davy Crockett. But then he showed up again when I started writing about 1950s California, the creation of Disneyland, and Walt Disney's own imagination of the American past. And I'm sure there are some people in the room who remember the Disney show about Davy Crockett and who could probably even sing the song.
I can sing the song.
I know. I don't know if we want that.
Davy Crockett, yes.
But there he was. His legend was really central to not only the Disney show, but the creation of Disneyland in the 1950s. And I do think that Disneyland is one of our most influential historic sites, even though a lot of people don't tend to think about it that way.
That's fascinating, and that makes sense, because he was... I was surprised by him in the writing of my last book, because he was simultaneously bound up with all of this sort of mythology of sorts, but he was a real politician. And I think I had met him mostly in the sort of myth of the guy from the West. When I was writing about him in Washington, he would decide, depending on the occasion, whether he would dress in a frock coat like a normal congressman, or whether there would be like Western buckskin. This is a Western buckskin occasion. I will dress as a Western, which I found fascinating, that he was choosing which persona he needed to be at any given time. So in a way, it doesn't surprise me that he keeps popping up in one way or another, in both ways, I guess, in the course of your book.
And one of the things that I did want to do with this book is find ways to engage these iconic American figures. The book opens, chapter 1, which is Philadelphia, opens with George Washington going on a road trip, because one of the first things that Washington did when he became president was decide that he needed to see every state and also be seen by the American people, that the president was going to be a symbol of this nation that no one was quite sure would actually hold together. And so there are lots of figures like that: Walt Disney, Henry Ford, Theodore Roosevelt, George Washington, and I really wanted to engage them and maybe find, if not entirely new things to say about them, maybe the things that we don't think of initially, and to put them in conversation with this whole vast social tapestry in which they lived. So it is both trying to do some history from the top down and some history from the bottom up, and sort of smash them together in the places where everyone, in fact, was living together, engaging with each other, for better and for worse.
And that's one of the great things about the book, is that it's, this will sound obvious, but it's built into the book. It's about people, right? So it's not, I'm sitting here, you know, venting enthusiastic about the spaces, but what's wonderful about it is that it's about the experience of the people in those moments, in those historic spaces, and about the experience of being a person in those spaces and how they communicate. And you do both of those, I think, really beautifully throughout the book. Were there things that you felt, and I realize your choice of where you went was selective, but were there things that over the course of your trip you felt were missing, that you were surprised weren't there?
Well, I would say there is a real lack of attention to the history of work and labor and working class people in our historical landscape. There are some places. When I went to Chicago, Chicago has a lot of Gilded Age history. This is a chapter on the late 19th and early 20th century, the Gilded Age and Progressive era. There are things like the Haymarket Memorial, which is a monument marking the Haymarket bombing of 1886, which is right in the middle of a major labor clash. I drove down to Terre Haute, Indiana, to the Eugene Debs house, which is, I think, a not widely visited, but should be widely visited historic site. So there are glimmers of it, but it's really striking to the degree to which that, and even our industrial past, right, the economic past of the country just has sort of retreated and doesn't have, I think, its great museum yet.
Now, I'm going to ask a question that I can predict on your ongoing book tour you are going to be asked many, many times, but it must be asked. And that is, and I have to say, this has to do with the semiquincentennial, which you call the semiquin.
That's right. It's much easier. You can all just say the semiquin.
I love that. I'm adopting that, the semiquin. But thinking about that and having gone through this experience and traveled the way that you did and thought about it and pulled it together in this book, how do you feel we should be thinking about the semiquin this year? What are some themes or ideas that now stand out to you as worth exploring in this particular moment? This is a really complicated time to be having any kind of landmark anniversary moment. So you seem perfectly positioned to sort of be getting at some of the maybe conflicting things that we should be talking about. What themes would you like to see emphasized this year?
Well, one premise of this book is that it is possible to know your history, know it deeply, face it, study it, think about it, and still love your country. And unfortunately, I think in our contemporary discourse, those things don't always go together all that well. There are lots of claims being made that if you want to be a patriot, if you want to somehow celebrate this moment, that it has to be done almost by neglecting, not knowing the real history of your country. So that is my ultimate goal with this book, is to hold on to both of those at the same time. I also would really like this book to be a guide for people who want to get out and explore the 250th for themselves. There's going to be a certain amount of official celebration and commemoration. Some of it will no doubt be spectacular and wonderful. Some of it will no doubt be quite cringy and terrible. But I wanted this book to be a set of tools for people to go out and explore it, and particularly to think about the ways that the local and the national are related. Every one of these places that I write about in this book is a place that for some period of time came to stand in for the nation at large, came to be the part of the country that people within the United States and around the world were looking to think about, hey, this is America, right? This is the dilemma, or this is the greatness, or this is the disaster that is America. And so I think being able to make connections between the local and the national, finding hints of that. And then the last thing I would say is that I hope that it disrupts a little bit of the political imaginary that I think has not been productive for this country, which is that we now are locked into the red-blue map as the way that we imagine what this country is and what it looks like and how it is divided. And one of the things that I understood a little bit going in, but that I really found as I was doing the research were the ways that all of these places ended up being connected to each other. People who started in one place ended up in another. Davy Crockett, for instance, and brought some of the history and the ideas and the challenges and conflicts and the baggage from one place to another. So we like to imagine ourselves as these kind of starkly divided, either red or blue places, but that's actually not very true to history. I don't think it's actually very true in most places to how a lot of people think and experience what it means to be American.
So, building off of that, and thinking, I've had historian brain and American brain. I'm going to ask you a question about professor brain. I'm assuming that you came away, not all of us get the chance to do this, and it actually sounds wonderful, and I would love the chance to do this sort of thing. Now that you've done it, and thinking about the ways in which you're going to be teaching American history going forward, how do you feel that this experience has changed your understanding of the national narrative? How do you think it might shift the way in which you're talking about American history with undergraduates coming forward this next fall?
Well, this is a stealth U.S. history survey course. I mean, maybe it's not so stealth, but it was intended, I think of it as very much a teaching book. I did not do any archival research or original research for this. The research was the travel and then really drawing on the secondary literature from many, many dozens of other historians. But I think it's a teaching book in the sense that I wanted to find a way to dig into these big questions and issues, but do it in a way that might be actually kind of fun, which is a word that I am a little worried that historians and professors in general are losing. I think it's not great when you see the historian or the professor come in the room and everybody goes, okay, now we're going to be scolded and we're going to get a lesson. And I think there are fun and interesting ways to engage. It was the inspiration for the class that we taught together. So Joanne and I, along with our colleague David Blight, who teaches the 19th century and the Civil War, in the fall we decided to teach all 250 years of American history in one semester at Yale. And we did it both with the undergraduates, so we had 300 or 400 undergrads in the class, and then we opened it to the local community, and so there were 300 or 400 members of the local community who came to lecture twice a week, and we recorded it, and we put it up online. We did a podcast together where
That's what I was going to say. It's online,
yeah,
so you can find it.
We had to do the reading. Joanne made me read all that early America stuff. It was very interesting, and I'm glad that I engaged it. So all of which is to say, I think it's made me try to think about the big sweep of American history, and it's made me think about national history as a category. I was saying, it's important to tie the local to the national, but in some ways, this category of national history, national identity, national meaning is one that's a little bit out of fashion in the historical profession at the moment. It's a category that a lot of people are suspect about for very good reasons. But I think particularly in this moment, it's really important to engage that with students, to enable them to ask their own questions and to maybe go on their own road trips.
And actually there was an assignment for our class that built on that, right? That we asked students to write about a historic site of some kind, to talk about what they thought about it, where it came from. So I actually hadn't even thought about that, but that's very book related. So now it all makes sense.
I thought about that.
I know you did. That's excellent. That was wonderful. So I want to circle back to where we began. So you began by talking about the fact that we have people now thinking that the story of the United States is a story of progress and it's all uphill, or that the story of the United States is a story of failure and it's all downhill. And some of that's political polarization, and some of that is any variety of other things that are all coming from the fact that the United States kind of as a whole is wrestling with what it is and where it's going and what it's been. So given all of that, and going back to where you started, is it a story of progress? Is it a story of failure? How would you discuss that now? How would you frame it now?
I would say it is a story of contest and change. I think it's not probably a great idea to give up on the idea of progress. That as a narrative has had lots and lots of problematic manifestations over time. Manifest destiny, that's progress, or we're the most special, exceptional nation, which is sometimes a claim that we stand outside of history. I think that American exceptionalism ideas about progress ought to be claims about standing inside of history, which is where we are all right now, whether we want to be there or not. And thinking about ways to intervene, improve upon the kinds of legacies that have been left to us, because there is nothing about this country's founding documents or its history that is self-executing. And so I would like to think of those terms not as things to be abandoned, but as prods to engage and to do better.
Okay, now I have all of the great questions that you guys passed along. And I love this question. What was poignant that you did not include, and why?
The place that comes to mind is Birmingham, Alabama, which I did not include. I went there for the civil rights chapter, but I wrote about Montgomery and Selma mostly, and a third city just was a lot for the chapter. But what was really striking about Birmingham, and then also became something I saw in other cities, was that we tend to include it in American history textbooks for one dramatic moment in 1963 when Martin Luther King and others were there fighting the battle for civil rights. And we don't often ask the question of what came next. And in Birmingham, a lot of aspects of that are a sort of a sad story, a story about population loss. And one of the places that really drove that home to me is that I went out to the church of a Birmingham civil rights activist named Fred Shuttlesworth, who was absolutely instrumental in the civil rights movement there in the 50s and 60s. And his church is still there. They're doing wonderful things to convert it into a more robust historic site. But the neighborhood in which that church sits is almost totally devastated. Many blocks only have one building standing at this moment. Parts of it are a Superfund site. And so it was pretty stark to be there. And to think about how we assess the successes or failures of the moment when this place usually makes the history books. And I saw that in a lot of different places, that we see a place or a person in one moment, but the story of what came next, if you're standing there, can actually be pretty poignant in many of those places.
Now this question builds on the fact, actually, it's not historian brain or American brain, it's traveler brain. So this question is, what more might historians do to further engage the public to explain the importance of the past? And well, interesting, it goes on to say, do graduate programs in history typically allow students to do the kind of work you've just done? So you've just meandered all over the place. So given that you were engaged as a traveler, you were going through the experience, you were the public, even though you were a particular kind of member of the public. What do you feel needs to be done to a greater degree for the public, particularly at this moment in time, particularly where there's such polarization about our history, but generally as well?
Well, I'd say that history should be a big tent enterprise, and so I don't think there's one thing that ought to be done. I think that there are lots of ways to reinvent the ways that we talk about history. So this is one experiment for me. In doing that, the class that we did together was another experiment. And I think to the degree that we can break out of some of the old ways of doing things or the accepted conventions, I think academic historians in particular could often be more creative about how we are presenting and the kind of language that we're using. I think there are many historic sites that I went to that probably could do a little better job of tapping into, I guess, the fundamental human connection with the past. I think one of the things that interests people about history is not just big questions about national identity, but really being able to make a human connection with a set of characters from the past. So the more that we can lean into the human, I think the better off we'll be. The answer to the graduate program question is no, you could not write a book like this as a dissertation. You got to get on the other side of tenure for that. But there are a lot of programs, Yale's included, that are trying to open up space to do different kinds of history. Public humanities is a category, public history of varying sorts. So I do think that that conversation is opening and that space is opening up. But yes, I would not recommend trying this as a graduate student, dissertation.
No. What I like about that question is that I think a lot of academics see academic history over here and public history over here. And I think that's a problem. Because I think academic history should be speaking to the public as the public would want to hear it, to understand it, to grab them, to bring them in. So I, as a historian, have very little patience for people who look down on historians who try to reach for the public. I think that that's a big part of our job. But what I like about the question is it raises that idea, as though there have to be two different things, academic history and public history, or that public history is somehow less than. And it isn't less than. It's actually, I think, at this particular moment, fundamentally important that Americans really understand their history in its, as you suggested at the beginning, in its entirety, good and bad, so that we all know as Americans where we're standing and how we got here and how we might move ahead.
For me, this was also a book that was a little bit about recapturing my own student self, my own enthusiast self, my own history buff self. Sometimes when you spend a lot of time in universities, you forget what exactly it was that was the spark that got you so interested in this thing in the first place, what made you want to spend your life doing this. And so for me, it was a re-engagement with that, and also an engagement with something that I've seen again and again. I think this room is testament to that, which is that there are thousands, if not millions, of people out there who love doing this sort of, right, who love kind of being able to engage with history in some direct or indirect way. But so I hoped that the history nerd in every small town in America,
in all of us,
and also in large cities, in all of us, could kind of connect with this and have some fun with it.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question, which kind of grows from what I just said. I am asked this now constantly. Any public-minded program I do, I am asked this question. I was asked this question at a Zoom lecture I gave this afternoon. Now you get to wrestle with this question.
I hope I get the answer right.
Oh, you will get the answer right, because there isn't one answer. The question is, thinking about our future, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Given that you now have this great vista, this standing point, and you've just reviewed all of this history, where do you land on your feet right now?
Well, I'm going to go optimistic, in part because playing a little against type here, and in part because I think that's a little bit of decision that we all have to make about this moment. There is a way to be reactive and to bemoan what's happening, and there are lots of things to bemoan. But there is also a drawing upon the examples of many, many people in American history who have looked out and said, I'm really worried about this country. I think in some fundamental way it might be done for, but I'm not going to back away from it and reject it. I'm going to engage it, try to reinvent it. And I think there's a lot of that energy out there now. Some of it's subdued. There are, of course, particular challenges of our own moment, technological, certain personalities that have an undue influence on American politics.
She said diplomatically.
Who are, a little historically unprecedented. But yeah, I think that optimism is a choice, and it seems like the better choice to make.
And I think, and you've heard me say this before, but I'm going to say it again because I have a microphone and I can. I think I tend to fall on the optimistic side, too. And in part, that's because ultimately, the country is grounded on us, right? It's grounded on we the people. And we can choose to know that, to own that, to come together to act on that. And that gives me hope, because in the same way, you see people who are interested in the history. They want to know more about the history. They come to events like this to learn about it. They're engaged with the current moment. They're upset by the current moment. All of the ways in which people are invested in our history and emotionally caught up in it. To me, the hope is that all of these people, in one way or another, understand that it is us, right? Our history is us, this country is us, and everything in this book testifies to what happens when people come together and try to do something positive, try to make positive change. So I'm a glass half full kind of gal too, because I believe in our ability to come together and do that at a moment like this where we need to realize that coming together gives us a sense of community that gives us power. With that highfalutin note, I want to thank you all for coming to this event. If you could please give a round of applause to Beverly Gage. Thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. I know New York Public Library appreciates it, and you heard about all of these amazing programs coming down the pike, so hopefully you'll come back for more. And now you get to be the crazy book signing woman.
I'll be the crazy book signing woman.
Thank you all
Joanne.
so much for coming.